A rallying cry for change, the Defund Police movement and its impact on local departments.
We're all for change, but we need to do it thoughtfully, and we need to think about the public that we serve as we do it.
The back and forth over how to spend public safety dollars, officers, or alternatives.
You have over $330 million. How are you using it to keep Oakland residents safe?
Reimagining and reforming the future of law enforcement.
We're going to create a safer environment in which public safety is at the forefront.
KTVU presents The Cost of California. Welcome to this KTVU special, Cost of California. We're diving deeper into four major topics: cost of living, education, the defund police movement, and homelessness. We're looking at them through the lens of the costs, the benefits, and an analysis of where your money is going.
No justice! No peace! I said no justice! No peace!
Today we're taking a closer look at the defund police movement. To some, the slogan means divest and abolish law enforcement structures. To others, it means reallocate money from police departments and invest in black and brown communities and alternative policing. Last summer, the defund movement hit a fever pitch following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Protests erupted in cities all over the country as people called for justice, structural change, and a reimagining of law enforcement. In Minneapolis, voters will decide whether or not to get rid of the police department and replace it with a new Department of Public Safety. The Floyd protests and calls continued after a jury found ex-officer Derek Chauvin guilty, and he was subsequently sentenced to 22.5 years in prison.
We got justice, but not enough justice. But I will celebrate a guilty conviction on a police officer that killed a black man, because far too many times we see them kill us and get right away with it.
We need true justice. That's not one case. That is a social transformation that says that nobody's beneath the law and no one is above it.
Let's take a look at some national numbers. According to the group Interrupting Criminalization, at least 20 large U.S. cities have cut their police budgets, those cuts adding up to about $840 million total. $160 million so far has been invested in communities. Cops have been removed from schools in 25 cities, equating to about $34 million saved. On the flip side, Bloomberg reports more than 20 large cities increased police spending in 2021. Opponents of defund argue it leads to rising crime and has led to the large numbers of officers leaving the force. As cities bounce back from COVID-19 funding levels, some are reversing course and refunding police. In New York, Mayor Bill de Blasio committed to cutting $1 billion from NYPD, but reinstated $92 million for a new precinct. In Los Angeles, after cutting $150 million last year, Mayor Garcetti increased the LAPD budget by 3%. He said to combat rising crime and to keep up with retirements. And in Minneapolis, the council voted to take $8 million from the police budget last year. This year, restoring $6.4 million to help hire more officers to replace those who've left. We'll get to some Bay Area cities, but first, let's show you the results of a USA Today Ipsos poll from July. 70% of those polled support increasing police budgets, but 62% also support reallocating some police budget to community policing and social services. Less than a quarter, 22%, say police treat all Americans equally. While national police reform bills have died in Congress, California lawmakers have sent Governor Newsom legislation to end the careers of problematic police officers. In part, the bill aims to keep troubled officers from jumping from one job to another. And it would create a mandatory new state license for officers that could be permanently revoked. The city of San Leandro recently cut $1.7 million from its police department. The move was spurred by the controversial police killing of Stephen Taylor last year and the national defund calls. But how the money is being reallocated isn't embraced by everyone. KTVU investigative reporter Evan Sernofsky explains how the Bay Area city's challenge mirrors a trend seen around the country.
It's one of the Bay Area's most diverse cities.
Big Six.
With neighborhoods that are both bucolic and working class, a marina and locally owned businesses. But this bedroom community of some 90,000 people was rocked to its core when police killed Stephen Taylor in April 2020.
Justice for
Things only got worse a month later when George Floyd was murdered.
We have to do something. We cannot continue to let this go on.
Addie Kitchen is Taylor's grandmother and raised him. Taylor was wielding a bat inside Walmart and experiencing a mental health crisis.
He loved me, and I loved him, and he never stopped letting me know that he loved me. And I never stopped letting him know how much I loved him.
The officer who killed Taylor resigned and was charged with involuntary manslaughter. He pleaded not guilty. Kitchen, meanwhile, has become a leading voice among many in the call to change policing in San Leandro.
Do you think, quote-unquote, defunding the police is the appropriate direction to go?
Yes, I do. I don't believe more policemen are going to solve the problems. If you take the money from law enforcement and put it back into the communities, I think that would be a step in the right direction.
It depends on where you are and who you are, on how the police deal with you.
The city initially looked at cutting $700,000 from a police program that caters to the homeless population. But ultimately, it agreed to cut 3 other positions: 1 lieutenant, a sergeant, and a police officer. That amounted to a cut of $1.7 million out of next year's $42.5 million police budget. This community is going through what so many other cities around the nation are facing, whether to radically upend policing as we know it, or to proceed with incremental change over time. But that's left activists frustrated, as well as people who rely on police and want to see more officers on the street.
We need to call them, and they need to come and protect our businesses. I rely on the police as a business owner, certainly.
We aren't paying them to be doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs. They're cops. They need to be cops.
We sat down with San Leandro's mayor, Pauline Russo-Cutter. She's been trying to balance the demands from all sides.
In our city, I want people to know the police are, the partners in this, and we're all working together.
Since Taylor's death, she said the police department has changed policies, including improving de-escalation training and hiring practices. They've also worked with the NAACP on recognizing racial bias. But she's against drastically cutting her city's police force.
You can't just all of a sudden flip and say, okay, now we've got a community out there that doesn't want crime or anything like that, and we're going to just get rid of half of our police force. That doesn't work.
In the end, San Leandro's cuts to the police budget don't really amount to substantial defunding. And finding money to invest in alternative programs is slow going. Those same issues are playing out in cities around the nation. Nevertheless, people like Stephen Taylor's grandmother will keep the pressure on communities like this one.
And I just know that he didn't die in vain, because we're working and we're trying to make changes. And we will fight until we do make the changes that are needed.
That was Evan Cernovsky reporting. In San Francisco, Mayor London Breed and Supervisor Shaman Walton announced the Dreamkeeper initiative in August of last year. Over the course of 2 years, the city planned to reallocate $120 million from law enforcement and invest it in the city's black community. Here's the mayor in May.
I was tired of the talk and reading the data. I wanted to put into action something that I knew would be helpful. And part of what I realized is money has always been a barrier to opportunity.
Breed announced the first $60 million would go towards things like guaranteed income, youth development, and entrepreneur support. While the police budget was cut initially, the mayor's office confirms Dreamkeepers will continue receiving money, but from the general fund. They explain as the city saw state and federal aid, all parts of the budget saw increases. Activists criticize the fact the money's not coming from police.
It's a good example of what could be done and the amount of work that could be done if we were to actually defund SFPD, and think about the amount of money that could be put into communities, put into things like Dreamkeepers and expanded Dreamkeepers in the future. And I think it's really clear that SFPD budget is a great place to be taking those funds. Healthcare, housing, education, the things that actually keep us safe and make sure that communities are thriving. I mean, if we just cut the SFPD budget to what it was 10 years ago, we could be providing rent vouchers to every single unhoused person in the city. And I think that keeps people safe much more than police ever could.
San Francisco is also taking steps to change the way it responds to certain calls. The city continues to expand its police alternatives. The street crisis response teams are made up of paramedics and behavioral health workers. They respond to calls involving mostly mental health and drug addiction issues. Oakland launched a similar program called MACRO, Mobile Assistance Community Responders of Oakland. SFPD Chief Bill Scott has been supportive of alternative responses, but he doesn't want to see his department's budget cut for it. The chief told me this needs to be a conversation about police and reform, not one or the other.
So we've lost more officers than we've been able to hire, which is a challenge for us. And our budget, we had some of our budgetary cuts restored, not all, but some, which was encouraging for us because last year, as you might recall, we had money that was refunded to support the African American community, which I said then and I say now, that was definitely necessary. We lost more officers than we thought we'd lose, and the overtime cuts, although we had to make the adjustments after the budget was cut as to where these cuts were, and some of these decisions were made for us. This year, we advocated to restore some of that, like our overtime. We've seen increases in crime this year, violent crime, homicides. We were up last year in homicides, and we started the year off in a really, really bad place in terms of our victims of gun violence. And so we needed to restore some of that funding and some of that to be able to deploy to address these issues. And the board, although we didn't get everything we asked for, we did get some cooperations from our board of supervisors. Definitely, a mayor was supportive of refunding some of that funding that we had gotten taken away from us.
Part of this conversation is about alternative response. And as you talk about some of those crisis response teams in the city, you've recently said that you support them, but not at the expense of taking from your budget. Do you want to expound on that?
Well, yeah. So definitely reallocation of funding is necessary and it needs to be thoughtful. But as I sit here as the chief of this police department, of course, I cannot support cutting our budget where we can't do the things that we've been asked to do from the public. And that is, stop crime when it happens, prevent it where we can, implement the reform that you and I have been talking about today. And those are things that the public has demanded of us. And, we need a budget to do that. There are some people that believe police departments should be abolished. I don't agree with that at all. There are people that think we can just overnight shift workloads to other departments. It's a lot more complicated than that. And we have to be thoughtful or else we end up with situations being worse off than they are. And that's been my position all along. It's like, we're open to change, but let's be thoughtful about it. And let's do it in a way that makes sense for our city. What we've seen in our city that works the best is when we collaborate and work where it's an and, not an or. And we see it over and over again. And look, I say that with the caveat of there are things that we don't need to have our hands in. But can we or should we be there as a supporting agency when those folks who do have their hands in this work need us? Absolutely. And that's what we're perfectly willing to do. And I think you make a great point that for too many people, it's an or, and it doesn't need to be an or. We need to work together on these issues because we are a society that really thrives when we collaborate.
The narrative that defund is responsible for any of this is absurd. Defund hasn't happened. No money has been taken away from OPD whatsoever.
Still to come, the city of Oakland grapples with an uptick in violent crime, but there's disagreement about whether to fund more officers or violence prevention measures. After the break, more on the decisions the council made about public safety. Amid a rise in violent crime, the city of Oakland is grappling over the best way to keep the public safe. Some argue more officers are needed. Others say that's a mistake and believe money is better spent on violence prevention. KTVU's Henry Lee shows us the debate.
Back in June, Oakland Police Chief LaRon Armstrong blasted a plan to give $18 million to violence prevention programs instead of the police department, saying his budget was being cut. He and Mayor Libby Schaaf said the city council's decision would hobble a shrinking department, further reduce response times, and make Oakland less safe.
Crime is out of control in the city of Oakland, and our response was for less police resources.
But a closer look at the numbers reveals Oakland police are actually getting more money over the next 2 years, not less. Police will get $674 million in the next budget cycle compared to the previous 2 years when they were allotted $635 million. But that's less than what the mayor wanted to give them.
The Oakland Police Department actually got a $38 million increase in their budget.
Oakland City Council member Carol Fife was among those who voted to redirect funds for violence prevention programs and a crisis team to respond to mental health calls. She says Oakland Police can do a lot with its annual $330 million budget.
What the community needs to be asking the Oakland Police Department is, you have over $330 million. How are you using it to keep Oakland residents safe?
Homicides have hit the 100 mark this year, far more than last year. Shootings are up 50%. The police union says a council that's embraced the defund movement is to blame.
The narrative that defund is responsible for any of this is absurd. Defund hasn't happened. No money has been taken away from OPD whatsoever.
Kat Brooks of the Anti-Police Terror Project says it's a matter of properly allocating resources.
Let's immediately have cops stop doing things that don't require a badge and a gun, i.e. responding to mental health crisis, responding to interpersonal violence, doing traffic stops, responding to fights.
I found that Oakland had the third highest per capita police spending of any city of that size in the United States.
University of Colorado criminologist Brendan Beck says investing money in social services does more to decrease crime.
Obviously, all cities need some amount of policing, but the research is pretty mixed on how much each additional dollar spent really decreases the crime rate.
Councilmember Sheng Tao was among those who approved a budget allowing for 4 police academies over the next 2 years. The mayor wanted 6. Now, Tao says she wants to fund those 2 other academies through cost savings from OPD. This week, the council approved one of those academies. Tao said she worked with the chief on her proposal.
And we were able to come up with a way where we can keep all the violence prevention interrupters, as well as adding on another police academy. So it's actually more fiscally responsible.
Critics say Tao's flip-flop that she initially voted to defund the police. But Councilmember Fife says despite all the uproar over defunding, there's no definition for what that actually means.
It means so many different things to so many people, and it's used as a weapon by some, and it's used as a rallying cry for others.
Finding the funding to staff the department has always been a delicate issue, but it's more fraught now with a force at just under 700 officers. If the department falls below 678 officers, the city won't be able to access funds from a parcel tax approved by the voters back in 2014.
It's making it really challenging for us to respond to these calls with these staffing numbers. I think for when it comes to morale, I mean, it really does have an effect on officers, belief that they are safe.
In Oakland, Henry Lee, KTVU, Fox 2 News.
For more on the debate over police spending in the city of Oakland, I spoke to Police Chief LaRon Armstrong. He addressed a grim milestone for the city, criticism of OPD's budget, and what he sees moving forward. A grim milestone for your city. Just tell me what is going on.
Well, we're having some tremendous challenges with gun violence. I think we've seen a proliferation of firearms throughout the city of Oakland. It's been very difficult for us to stop this stream of firearms from entering our community. So we are, working tremendously hard with our local law enforcement partners, which includes our federal partners, our state level partners, as well as our local county partners to try to address it. Some of it is group and gang violence. Some of it is just violence that is related to confrontations. We didn't usually see these things escalate to gun violence, but they have.
Chief, as you know, the council approved another academy. You're not going to see those rookies for some time, but what kind of message do you receive from the council to see that?
Well, I think that's the beginning of, I believe, the council showing support for the department, recognizing the calls of the community for more police resources, seeing the fact that crime is far too high across our city.
Chief, as you know, the plan was not without opposition. There's been opposition to what the department received in the new budget, and that not enough is being funneled to social services. What would be your response to that criticism?
As someone that has been a huge supporter of violence prevention and violence intervention, I think there simply needs to be a balance. I think in a city that is continuing to grow, who is approaching 440,000 residents, we have to have adequate public safety resources, enough officers to respond to the high volume of calls that we're receiving every single day. And these calls are not police generated. These are calls from community members that are in need of help. So it's always challenging for me to hear city leaders say that the department does not need these resources. These resources are directly needed to respond to the calls of our community, to the calls of our residents who have emergencies.
One of the criticisms and one of the questions that critics ask is, how is Oakland PD using its budget that has increased to keep people safe? What would be your response?
We are using the budget as effectively as we can. I think it's clear. We have a small number of officers that are assigned to our patrol division. Those officers are inundated with calls every day. We have another small number of officers assigned to our investigative units. Those investigators are inundated with investigations. And then we have our street teams that are out conducting enforcement actions, because when you have 100 homicides and you recover over 150 firearms in your community, it says that there are some really crime-related issues that need to be addressed. And these officers are doing that. And so the workload, it far exceeds what we have, but having 55 positions frozen is definitely something that is concerning. You would like to have access to those officers. You would like to see this department grow just like this city is growing.
Governor Newsom, we want you to do this. Declare the state of emergency for City of Oakland. We want you to bring in California Highway Patrol.
The CHP began patrols in Oakland this month. Officers will be patrolling streets where there are a lot of traffic accidents and dangerous driving. The collaboration between the city and OPD came after pleas from Chinatown leaders concerned with crime in the area. Their presence is drawing some protests.
This is not about safety. This is not about increasing the safety of Oakland or Oaklanders. This is about the manipulation of the fear and the pain of communities of color.
We don't want more police. We don't want more law enforcement. We want real solutions.
Take a little risk, reimagine what you're doing, and then evaluate. Does it have the outcome that we want?
After the break, using data and research to change law enforcement, the Center for Policing Equity looks to drive departments towards systemic change. Stay with us. The Center for Policing Equity uses data science to measure behaviors and lobby for policy changes with an eye on justice and equity. Former Salt Lake City Police Chief Chris Burbank is urging departments to measure their reforms on the basis of their outcomes.
We've been training officers for years, and it has not changed the outcome. What we're starting to see is when we change what the officers do, not simply how they do it, but what they do, we then start to see some significant results in decreases in use of force, misdemeanor arrests, and quite frankly, just violent encounters in both directions.
What are some of those examples that you would like to see police funding go towards, whether in the department or in the greater infrastructure of the city?
Well, I think it's putting money away from enforcement activities to prevention activities, because the number one goal of policing, at least that I thought, was to prevent crime from occurring, not catch it after the fact. So the notion of waiting until it happens and then taking action is archaic, and it just results in more people incarcerated, more court time. There's so many different things when small measures can actually prevent. The compromise that we need to come together is, one, we need to measure, because for years, well, for history, we have not measured what police officers do with the actual outcome. There's not a correlation that exists between the number of police officers and the crime rate. But yet everybody thinks, oh, we got a crime problem, but more police at it. And then when you have a violent crime and you throw more police officers at it, you spend more resources, and you look at who are they arresting, not people engaged in this violent crime. These are misdemeanors.
What is your message to those police chiefs about what they need to do to look inside themselves and look outward towards change?
What we found, interestingly enough, is access to health care has more impact on crime rates than anything the police ever do. So we need to then, one, we're going to look historically. Two, we're going to also look holistically at the problem. Because we always want to say the police are the solution. No, the police should work together with the healthcare system, the education system. How can we avoid the negative contacts? Right? The police will still have a role, but over time and over history, we've expanded that role to be exponential because you've had this ready force, right? We're paying these people, they got guns, they'll go anywhere, send the cops. No, now it's time to say, no. Let's look at what the alternatives are. And in most cases, those alternatives are far less expensive than sending an armed police officer.
Thanks for watching. See you next time.